The bell rang sharply through the corridors of Jefferson Middle School, signaling the start of another day. Students shuffled through the hallways, chatting about homework, video games, and weekend plans. Among them walked James Carter, a quiet and thoughtful 13-year-old boy, with earbuds tucked under the hood of his jacket, piano music playing softly into his ears. He didn't say much to anyone. He didn't have many close friends. But what James had was a gift, a deep, raw connection to music, especially the piano. At home, he could sit for hours, lost in the sound of the keys, teaching himself from YouTube videos and his late grandfather's dusty music books. It was his escape, his passion, his voice in a world that often refused to hear him. James turned the corner into the arts wing, pulling one earbud out as he approached room 104, Miss Waverly's music class. He took a deep breath. This was the part of the day he dreaded most. Not because he disliked music, far from it, but because of who was teaching it. Miss Waverly was in her early 50s, with sharp eyes that scanned the room like searchlights and a smile that never quite reached her eyes. She dressed with old-fashioned elegance, always in blazers and brooches, her grey-streaked hair tightly pinned into a bun. On paper, she was qualified, experienced, and professional. But in reality, she carried herself with a kind of cold authority, the kind that made kids shrink in their chairs. She didn't shout. She didn't have to. Her comments were cutting, subtle, and always delivered with a false sweetness that made them sting more. And for some students, especially students like James, she was worse. She never said anything explicitly cruel, but her tone when addressing him was different, more dismissive, more mocking. If a white student answered a question wrong, it was a learning opportunity. If James stumbled, it was barely concealed amusement. That morning, James entered the room quietly and took his usual seat in the back. Miss Waverly stood at the front, arms folded, tapping a long pointer stick against her clipboard. "Class," she began. "Today we're discussing musical expression and interpretation. The idea that music isn't just about notes and timing, it's about feeling, emotion, telling a story." James perked up a little. This was something he actually cared about, Miss Waverly continued, walking slowly between the rows of desks. "Some people think they understand music just because they listen to it all the time," she said, casting a glance toward the back of the room, toward James. "But listening and performing are two very different things." A few kids turned to glance at him. He looked down, heart starting to race. "Now," Miss Waverly said, her voice taking on a sharper edge, "why don't we have a little demonstration?" She scanned the room before her eyes locked on James. "You there, James, isn't it?" He looked up slowly. "I've noticed you doodling little music notes during class," she said with a tight smile. "You must be quite the musician. How about showing us what you can do?" James froze. His first instinct was to say no. He wanted to disappear into his seat, to vanish behind his notebook. But all eyes were on him now. Some students smirked, already expecting a disaster. They didn't know him well, but they knew how this worked. When Miss Waverly called someone out, it was never for a good reason. He hesitated, but Miss Waverly's raised eyebrow made it clear that no wasn't an option. With a silent sigh, James stood up and walked slowly toward the piano at the front of the room. It was an upright Yamaha, old but well-maintained. He had dreamed of playing on it since the first day of school but never dared to touch it. Now he approached it not as a dream, but as a challenge, one rooted in mockery, not encouragement, He sat down, He felt every nerve in his body pulse with anxiety. His palms were sweaty, his legs shaky. He could feel the weight of the room pressing on him, the anticipation, the doubt, the unspoken prejudice. Miss Waverly stood nearby, arms crossed, clearly expecting him to falter. It wasn't about music, to her. It was about putting him in his place. James closed his eyes for a moment, trying to block everything out. He thought of home. He thought of his grandfather's piano, the old creaky bench, the way the sun hit the keys in the late afternoon. He thought of the songs he practiced night after night, the way they made him feel safe, whole. He inhaled deeply, let the air fill his lungs, and exhaled slowly. Then he placed his hands on the keys. There was a moment of stillness in the room, an inhale before the unknown. James pressed the first key, a gentle E, letting it ring through the silence. Then another. And another. What began as a hesitant whisper grew into a stream of sound, smooth and delicate. His fingers moved with more confidence as the melody took shape, complex, heartfelt, unexpected. The smirks in the room began to fade. Students sat up straighter, eyes widened. The notes poured out of James like water breaking through a dam. He didn't look at anyone. He didn't need to. He was somewhere else, somewhere the judgment couldn't reach him. Each chord told a story of loneliness, of resilience, of hope. The room, once buzzing with low murmurs and half-hidden laughter, was now frozen in awe. Even Miss Waverly, who had been standing so confidently just moments before, found her arms slowly uncrossing. Her mouth parted slightly, confusion flickering across her face. This wasn't what she expected. This wasn't what she wanted to happen. And yet she couldn't stop it. No one could. James played on, unaware of the shift he had caused, pouring everything he had into those keys. Not to impress, not to prove anything, but simply because it was his truth, his music, his voice. And in that moment, it rang louder than anyone else's in the room. James's fingers moved across the keys like they were born to be there. Every note carried emotion that was deeper than anything the classroom had ever witnessed. It wasn't just that he was playing well, he was transforming. Gone was the shy, quiet boy from the back of the room. In his place was an artist, completely absorbed in his craft, commanding the piano with a quiet power that couldn't be ignored. The melody rose and fell like waves, sometimes smooth and flowing, sometimes crashing with intensity. He mixed classical structure with soul, a bit of jazz improv sliding in as though it belonged there. The room, once buzzing with quiet snickers, was still. Even the students who usually paid no attention to anything were leaning forward in their seats, mesmerized. The girl who had been scrolling through her phone stopped mid-swipe. The boy whispering jokes to his friend suddenly forgot the punchline. Everyone was watching. Everyone was listening. James didn't look up, didn't glance around to see the effect he was having. He didn't need to. He wasn't playing for them. He was playing for himself. For every time he was told he wasn't enough, every moment he was underestimated, every silent judgment he felt walking through these halls. This was his way of speaking back without ever having to raise his voice. Each note echoed with meaning. It was as if he was telling his whole life story through music. His mom working late shifts to support them, the nights he stayed up practicing, because he couldn't afford lessons, the joy of mastering a difficult passage, the heartbreak of feeling unseen. The music captured it all, and though the room remained silent, it was a heavy, respectful silence. No one dared interrupt. Miss Waverley, who had been standing smugly at the front of the room just minutes earlier, found herself rooted in place. Her arms had slowly dropped to her sides, and her expression had gone from amused to puzzled to something close to stunned. She watched James's hands, strong, precise, expressive. He wasn't playing from a sheet, wasn't reading music. He didn't need to. This was all in his head. No, in his heart. It wasn't a performance in the traditional sense, it was a release. And it was something she couldn't deny. She had heard thousands of students play over the years, some good, some gifted, most just trying to pass the class. But what she was hearing now wasn't just talent. It was genius. It was authenticity. She felt it. Everyone did. For a brief moment, Miss Waverley tried to remind herself of her original goal. She had called him up expecting failure, maybe even to prove a point about the importance of formal training, of following the rules. She wanted to expose what she assumed would be his lack of discipline or understanding. But as she watched him now, she knew those thoughts were gone. And in their place was something she wasn't used to feeling in her own classroom: humility. James brought the piece to a close with a slow, deliberate chord. He held it for a second, then let it fade naturally. His hands rested on the keys for a beat longer, as if he didn't want to let go just yet. Then he pulled them away, slowly, gently. The sound disappeared into the silence. The room remained still. No one clapped right away. It was like they had all forgotten how to respond. Then, slowly at first, someone started to clap. Then another. And another. Within seconds, the room erupted in applause, loud and full of disbelief. Students who barely knew James were whistling, clapping, some even standing. It wasn't forced. It wasn't polite. It was genuine. James stood up slowly, his eyes downcast, a little unsure of what to do with all the attention. He wasn't used to it. He had never played in front of more than a few family members. Now here he was, being celebrated by classmates who had never really noticed him before. He glanced up once, just briefly, and saw their faces: shock, amazement, admiration. And then he looked at Miss Waverley. She hadn't moved. Her expression was frozen somewhere between awe and discomfort. She didn't clap. She didn't smile. She just stared at James like she was seeing him for the first time. And in a way, she was. The version of James she had, constructed in her mind, didn't fit the boy standing in front of her now. Her assumptions, her quiet prejudices, they had all been shattered in the span of 3.5 minutes, and she had no words. James didn't wait for her approval. He didn't need it anymore. He nodded politely, then walked back to his seat. As he passed his classmates, some gave him high fives, others simply stared, still trying to process what they had just witnessed. When he sat down, his heart was still racing. But for the first time, it wasn't from fear. It was from something else. Freedom, maybe. Relief. Pride. Miss Waverley finally spoke, her voice softer than usual. "That was unexpected," she said, almost to herself. Then louder, addressing the class, she added, "Well, that was certainly moving. It was the closest thing to praise she had ever given." James didn't respond. He didn't need to. He sat quietly, hands folded in his lap, looking out the window as the class settled down again. What no one realized in that moment was how much had changed. For James, this wasn't just about playing the piano. It was about proving, first, to himself, then to everyone else. That he didn't have to fit into anyone's box. That his talent, his voice, his story mattered. For his classmates, it was the first time many of them had seen past the quiet kid in the back and recognized something extraordinary. And for Miss Waverly, though she would never say it out loud, it was a lesson in humility, a realization that brilliance comes in many forms, not all of them expected. And though the day would go on, books would open, the bell would ring again, and the next subject would begin, something had shifted in that room. James had changed the atmosphere. He had taken control of his own narrative. And in doing so, he had left a mark that no one, not even Miss Waverly, would forget. The last note still hung in the air, its echo fading like the final word of a conversation that didn't need to be spoken aloud. James sat in silence, staring, down at the polished keys of the classroom piano, still half dazed from the intensity of what had just happened. Around him, the energy in the room had shifted completely. His classmates, moments ago indifferent or skeptical, now looked at him with something approaching awe. It was the kind of attention James wasn't used to, not the kind laced with pity, or teasing, or assumptions, but the kind reserved for someone who had earned respect. He slowly stood up and walked back to his seat, still feeling the weight of 100 eyes following him. But unlike before, it didn't feel hostile. It felt like a spotlight had been turned on him, not to expose him, but to reveal him. A few classmates whispered as he passed, but their voices carried a different tone now, curious, impressed, even embarrassed at their own previous judgment. James lowered himself into his chair and took a deep breath, trying to bring his heartbeat back to normal. He glanced down at his hands, still tingling from the performance. It was strange, he thought, how something he did every day in his bedroom could feel so overwhelming in front of others. But he wasn't sorry. Not one bit. Miss Waverly stood at the front of the class, and for the first time since James had met her, she looked genuinely unsure of what to say. Her composure, usually pristine and tightly wrapped like her hairstyle, had slipped. She didn't hold her pointer stick. Her clipboard was forgotten on the side table. She simply looked at James, and it was clear her mind was struggling to catch up to what her eyes had just witnessed. "Well," she said eventually, her voice quieter than usual. "That was unexpected." The class sat quietly, waiting for more. But there was nothing more. No criticism, no correction, no sarcastic remark disguised as a lesson. Just that one word. Unexpected. James didn't flinch. He didn't nod. He simply looked back at her, calm and collected, his silence speaking for itself. He didn't need her approval. Not anymore. The rest of the class passed in a daze. Miss Waverly attempted to resume the lesson, stumbling through a half-hearted discussion on dynamics and phrasing, but her usual sharpness was gone. Her authority, though not broken, had been humbled. She avoided looking at James directly, instead focusing her gaze on her notes and the chalkboard. But everyone noticed the shift. Even the students who had never cared much about music now seemed alert, watching her every move, silently measuring how she'd handle the blow to her ego. When the bell finally rang, the students filed out of the room buzzing with chatter. Though few congratulated James awkwardly, offering fist bumps or a "Dude, that was insane," as they passed him by. He nodded politely, grateful but still unsure how to navigate the sudden change in social weather. He didn't want to be famous. He didn't crave attention. He just wanted to play. But he knew something big had happened, something that would ripple beyond this one classroom. As James gathered his things, Miss Waverley approached him slowly. He felt her presence before she spoke. "James," she said, her voice less formal now, almost hesitant. He turned and looked up at her. Her expression was difficult to read. Part discomfort, part something that might have been respect. "I wasn't aware you had that level of ability," she said. "You've clearly had a lot of practice." James nodded, unsure how to respond. She wasn't apologizing, not directly, but the change in tone, the softening of her words, told him everything he needed to know. "I hope," she continued, "you'll consider performing at the spring recital. We're always looking for strong soloists." James raised an eyebrow slightly, not in defiance, but in quiet acknowledgement of what she was doing. This was her way of extending an olive branch, of shifting the narrative without admitting fault. "I'll think about it," he said simply. She nodded. "You should. You have something rare." With that, she turned and returned to her desk, her posture just a bit stiffer than before. James left the room and stepped into the hallway, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, lockers slamming, voices echoing. But the noise didn't touch him the way it usually did. For the first time in a long while, he felt like he was walking taller, even if he wasn't consciously trying to. Something had settled inside him, a confidence that hadn't been there before, at least not so fully. When he got home that afternoon, his mother was at the kitchen counter, sorting through bills. She looked up as he walked in and smiled. "Hey, baby. How was school?" James dropped his bag by the door and took a second before answering. "It was, different." She raised an eyebrow. "Good different or bad different?" He thought about it. About Miss Waverley's stunned face, about the applause, about the way the room had changed just by him doing what he loved. "Good different," he said, and smiled. Later that night, James sat at his own piano, the old upright that had been his grandfather's. The wood was chipped in places, the keys slightly yellowed, but to James, it was still the most beautiful thing in the world. He rested his fingers on the keys and began to play, not for an audience, not for validation, but for himself. The notes filled the small apartment like they always did, wrapping the walls in warmth and memory. As he played, he didn't think of Miss Waverley, or his classmates, or even the recital she'd mentioned. He thought about how good it felt to be heard, really heard, not just seen as someone who didn't belong or wasn't expected to shine. For the first time, he felt like maybe the world was just a little more open than it had seemed that morning, and somewhere in a quiet house across town, Miss Waverley sat alone in her study, a cup of tea cooling beside her. She stared out the window, thinking not just about James, but about herself, about how many students she had misjudged, how many voices she might have silenced without even realizing it. She wouldn't admit it to anyone else, but in the solitude of her home, she let the truth settle in. James had taught her something that day, without a single lecture or word of criticism. He had taught her that brilliance has no fixed face, no single background, no predictable origin. It lives in the hearts of those who dare to express it, who find strength in vulnerability, and who speak through their passion when the world refuses to listen. And in doing so, he had changed not just one classroom, but the story of who gets to be seen,